Hey everybody, it's Grayson here with Based Theory, and today I'm joined by a special guest. Snake was right. So
I'm special.
yeah, I just want to say that everybody should go ahead and check out Snake was Right's YouTube channel. I've seen him do a bunch of debates. Oh, God, that getting feedback. Such a noob. Okay, so yeah, everybody should check out his channel. I think he does some great work in the debatosphere. I mean, if you're familiar with me, you're probably already familiar with him, but if you're not, check out his debates. He does a great job. We agree on way more than we disagree about. So if you didn't know, I recently did a debate with Robert Janus on geocentrism that ended in a rage quit, and Janus has agreed to debate Snake was right. So, Snake, how did that come about? And I guess what kind of approach do you think that you're going to be taking with your upcoming Janus debate, and when is that?
The 24th, I think,
Okay.
of August. And I basically just got a text from Standing for Truth and was like, "You want to debate some Janus?" And I was like, "Yeah." Because
Nice.
I mean, I pretty much accept every debate, but
I mean, I saw you do that debate with Howard on the existence of dragons, so it
I
does
know.
seem like you're willing to debate most subjects.
The crazier, the better. Although when it happens, I almost regret it.
Yeah,
But
that was pretty high levels of crazy. If anybody hasn't seen that one, talking about, you know, vampires and the JQ and dragons and uh, things frozen in rock, giant elephants, just really off the rails. It was impressed with your level of patience to do that.
every conspiracy, basically.
So, I just
But
wanted
yeah,
to ask in regards to Janus, sort of how familiar are you with some of his arguments or what he's going to try to lay out?
well, I wasn't. I thought he was a flat earther at first.
Okay, yeah, he's pretty close to. He uses a lot of the same arguments as flat earthers, but
Yeah,
he will actually debate against them and wrote an entire book against the flat Earth.
yeah. Which there is definitely some crossover. So I heard geocentrism and I was like, okay, that's basically a synonym for flat Earth. But apparently there are, there's some Venn diagrams going on.
So
But
Janus's whole conception is so weird because he basically relies on like special relativity with just changing the inertial reference frame. So he'll just say, "Oh, well, if you take the inertial reference frame of the Earth as if it's stationary, then the whole universe would rotate around it in 24 hours and we would observe all the same physics that we do today." That's his conclusion. So he just thinks because, in relativity, physics is the same regardless of your inertial frame of reference. He's basically just taking that principle. So if you try to point out to him things like the Coriolis effect or stellar parallax or any of the traditional things that most sane and rational people will conclude that the earth is rotating or moving, he will just say, well, we would observe all of those same observations if the earth was stationary and the whole universe was rotating around it. That's his basic point. So no matter what evidence you bring up to him, he'll just say, oh, well, we would expect to observe that too. And he's going on the principle that there can be no observation that differentiates between the universe rotating around a stationary earth and the earth rotating in the universe, as the consensus scientific understanding of it would be.
yeah,
His entire everything is going to boil down to that. So basically, you have to be able to get him on that.
well, so going off of my flat Earth, I was really big into. I wasted probably entire weeks and months on Facebook arguing with flat earthers a few years ago.
Yeah, so I think we've all been down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, yeah. And so I was thinking to go along the lines of like, because he relies on like the Michelson-Morley experiment and stuff. And like flat earthers, he concludes the exact opposite of what the actual conclusions of the experiments were for the ether and things like that. So I could start there. I would need to brush up a little bit on.
So, like, with both like Michelson Morley and with Airy's failure and the later Michelson did another experiment with Gale, the Gale Michelson Gale Pearson experiment. He'll probably bring up those three, and he'll basically try to avoid talking about why the lack of an existence of an ether would completely explain the results of those experiments. And when I tried to bring that up in my debate with him, he even lied publicly and said, "I've read the Wikipedia page on Airy's experiment, and it doesn't mention ether." And literally, if you go to that Wikipedia page, that it is literally called Airy's ether drag experiment. And he'll just say, "Oh, no scientist says this is about ether, and it's only mentioned in the intro for Airy's paper." And he doesn't understand that Airy's entire experiment was designed to test the undulatory theory of light, which is a theory of light's behavior that relies on the assumption of a luminiferous ether. So it doesn't necessarily explicitly state, I'm testing the existence of ether in Airy's paper, but the theory he is testing relies on the existence of ether. So if there's no ether, then Airy's failure to get a result is completely explained and rational. And he will refuse to admit that. He will lie to try to deny that. And he'll do the same thing with general relativity. If you tell him that information cannot travel faster than the speed of light in C, in a vacuum, he'll just deny that and say general relativity doesn't say that. And he'll say, you actually don't understand general relativity, and I understand it better than all of the relativity physicists
Of course,
in the world. Yeah. So he'll lie about that. He'll say that there is no reason to think that there's a speed limit in the universe, and that's what allows the whole universe to rotate all around the Earth in a 24-hour period.
That was going to be my other kind of line of
a good way to get him on that. Our conversation never actually got to any of the substantive science before he left. That's another thing. I guess don't characterize his arguments with any adjectives. Don't say silly. Don't say nonsense. Don't characterize his arguments in any way that would hurt his ego, because he'll just leave. But what I was going to say is, the thing I would get him with that is to say, like Hubble's law or Hubble's parameter, right? Where the more distant the galaxies, the more redshifted they are. Like the patterns of redshift that we see have no sensical explanation if the galaxies are not all expanding away from us, but they're rotating. So they would have to be expanding and rotating. And if they're rotating, we would expect to see not a Doppler effect, but we would expect to see other optical effects. And Einstein, there's a quote on one of Einstein's books even, where he explicitly talks about this. Maybe I could try to find the quote if you wanted to include that, but because he's probably going to quote Einstein. I don't know if you're familiar with Einstein's letter to Mach. A lot of flat earthers will bring that up all the time, because anything that you tell him about, Coriolis, or any of these forces that we feel because the Earth is rotating, he'll say the rest of the universe imparts that because of Mach's principle, and he'll act like this is real and established science, but like Mach's principle is not a well-respected or established or acknowledged or validated principle in physics. He'll claim it is. He'll claim that relativity proves Mach's principle, but no physicist would agree with him on that. And Mach's principle basically means that inertia is not a fundamental aspect of mass, but inertia is imparted on material from the rest of the mass of the universe around it. So it's like a really weird principle. And Einstein was a big fan of Mach when he was younger, and he wrote a letter to Mach in like 1913 or 1914 or something. It was before he developed general relativity, and he wrote a letter to Mach saying, this is wonderful. I've proven your ideas or whatever, and flat earthers and geocentrists will take that letter out of context, and they'll ignore the fact that later on in Einstein's life, he pretty much denounces Mach like wholly. And this was after he understood general relativity. He's no longer writing any support for Mach. So they'd like to take things out of context, but I would say it's a safe bet that Janus is going to try to quote Einstein to try to tell you that you don't understand relativity. He does that in most of his debates.
Yeah, it's like all pseudoscience where they deny the really rigorously tested models, but then they have some random hypothesis that has no support, and they're like, that's absolutely true.
And that's why in my debate with him, I tried to bring up the analogy of a man falling off of a ladder or something. And so if you're falling from something, then you have an inertial frame of reference, just like the Earth does. And so it's completely like within relativity, it's completely fair. It doesn't change any physics to say that you're not falling. The Earth and the whole universe is rising to you and is moving to you, and you're not moving at all. That's completely allowed in relativity. And I was trying to basically illustrate that to show how silly that is, to like if people actually believed that, and that's all that Janus is doing, is he's just trying to change the inertial frame of reference to the entire Earth, just like you'd be trying to change it to that man falling off a ladder. And the conclusions are equally silly. You have to believe that the entire Earth is rising up to meet that man, and like again, that's allowed in relativity. The math doesn't change, the physics don't change, but I think just a normal, sane, rational person is not going to think that that's the way that the universe really is. So if that was the main approach I did, and he did not like that. I think you could also equally just say, you could take all the arguments that he uses and use them to say that Mars is actually the center of the universe. And you could do all his calculations or whatever as Mars as the central inertial frame. Like you could pick any inertial frame of reference and all of his arguments apply to it. So the only reason he chooses Earth is because the Bible. I mean, that's really it. And he wants to cover that up, and he'll bring out a lot of scientific jargon, and he'll try to make it seem like this is what relativity says, this is what physics says. But I mean, that's my prediction for how that debate's going to go. So I've seen people try to bring up stuff to him like stellar parallax or like epicycles and like observe like things that would convince a normal person that the Earth is not the center of the universe. Mm-hmm. He's going to just dismiss all that and say if Earth is the inertial reference frame, all the physics is the exact same. So he's going to try to just dismiss all that. So that's his strategy. So I just thought I'd warn you so that you know what he's going to do before that debate.
Yeah. Is it worth it all going into the model of, because I don't know much about this, but I've been introduced to the subject probably just through school or something, where when we transitioned to Helocentrism, the previous model had all the planets. They had like these weird loop-de-loops around the Earth.
The epicycles.
But when that's epicycles.
Yeah. So, and he'll just say, like he has a little computer model or whatever, where it's all the planets revolving around the sun, but then you just change the point of view so that the Earth stays the same, but all the motions relative to the Earth are the same. So he'll just point to that. And he'll just say, look, if you just change your perspective, then you have all the same motions. So it's just a game of reference frames. That's all he's going to do. And it's all going to come back to reference frames. So he's going to just try to pull that angle. I can just tell you that much from what I'm familiar with his arguments. But yeah, as long as you stroke his ego and make him feel like a big respected man, then he should at least be able to stay for the whole argument. So
yeah, cool. Well, we'll see.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess I wanted to talk to you about Janus, so thanks for joining me with that. And I'm really looking forward to your debate with him. But the other reason I wanted to have you on is because I think we were on a stream together, and I didn't know any of your political leanings, and I think I made the comment that like I just thought libertarians never think their position all the way through. And then you said, oh, I'm a libertarian, and I felt a little embarrassed and was like, oh, I'm sorry.
And then I hung up and went home and cried.
Yeah, then you felt really disrespected, and then you
Yes.
rage quit. No, I'm kidding. You're a man. You stick around and you can have a discussion with someone that disagrees, and then so I wanted to talk with you, and I wanted you to potentially prove me wrong, and show that you have thought through your position. So I guess the first question that I had for you is a common thing that I hear amongst libertarians is that taxation is theft. Is this something that you agree with in principle, or like, what are your thoughts when people say that?
Yeah, I think there's no other way to conceptualize it other than theft. However, I would add on the caveat, it may be justified theft, which I believe there are lots of instances of justified theft. So, like a full-on anarchist would say, no, there's no justification for it. But a libertarian who's not an anarchist, I think, has room in that model to say there is justification for taxation, because libertarians are not not necessarily anarchists. Most aren't. Um, so they do believe in a minimalistic government, and I think there would have to be some taxation for that. So I
Okay.
think to steelman the argument for taxation is like it's a necessary evil, basically.
Okay, well, as long as you recognize that it is necessary, because I think that your conception of having a minimal government, I mean, I'm certainly not in favor of superfluous government. I think that
Mm.
maybe the key disagreement we might have is what we would consider to be the minimal necessary government. Um,
Yeah, because I mean, technically, you could say, well, the minimum necessary government is absolute and total totalitarian tyranny. So it's kind of a self-referential loop to say, oh, I just want the minimal amount of government, but because everyone kind of does, but libertarian thought is more on the lines of like, well, government is coercive and bad. We're gonna try and get as little of this evil as possible because it's all coercive, but a little bit is necessary.
So I just kind of what I'm interested in is getting an idea of sort of what your vision for an optimized government might be. So I've heard the term minarchism thrown around in terms of like libertarians that want more government than maybe an anarchist would. They want the minimal government, and I've heard three basic kind of branches, if you will, of minarchists generally say that the government should have a military, a police force, and courts. So I want to ask, do you agree that these three are minimally necessary? And then what other kinds of governmental services would you put on top of that, if any?
Yeah, I mean, I would probably put on top of that some kind of um, what do you call it? Internal affairs, something that can monitor the government itself, or have some way of um, civilian oversight of the government itself, because corruption is basically the main concern here. Is the bigger the government gets or the more power it has, the more corrupt it is, and the more it gets in bed with big business and the more it starts hurting people. So that's kind of the main concern of libertarians.
So I have a
But I would also I would probably go a little further than most on things like healthcare, and the reasoning there is, and I wouldn't necessarily, well, I wouldn't want to destroy any competition in private healthcare markets, but the reasoning there is we have this military to protect us from macro organismic threats like human soldiers or bombs or
and
made by,
tigers.
and the police would protect you from a mountain lion or something like that. But we don't seem to conceptualize assaults and invasions of diseases, or like infectious diseases, or just endemic diseases that are just like from um just cholesterol or things like that. We don't conceptualize that as like national defense, and I don't actually see a difference between defending the nation from a disease and defending the nation from an invading army. So I think that should be part of it. But I think that the duty of a government is to protect the people and keep the peace, and that's about it.
Okay, so on that note, that the duty of a government is to protect the people. So then would you be in favor of like food and drug regulations so that you make sure that food is served to people with a certain like standard, or medicine has to be proven to be efficacious, or it can't be literally poison or snake oil or something? Like doctors have to be credentialed within a state, basically. That's the current system anyway. If a doctor could be credentialed by any company, then I don't know how. I mean, would you be in like building regulations or bridge regulations to protect people's health?
Probably less so or along building regulations, because I think that can negatively affect poor people a lot. But as far as mostly in principle, yes, because I think that most of those examples would be examples of fraud. And I think that fraud is just as much a problem as actually violent assaults. So that would
Okay,
be
so then
against
also,
libertarian principles, against the free market, for you to be defrauding customers.
so you also want like financial regulations to prevent like Ponzi schemes or like outright scams or stuff like that.
Sure.
And I'm a little bit I'm concerned when you say you don't want that many building regulations, because like when you if you go to buy a house, do you
Mhm.
have to I mean you really have to do your due diligence in a libertarian world to make sure, it's wired correctly, everything is set up. I mean, like if there's no regulations, there's no building codes, then you know how can, I mean, you could be sold a house that could be a death trap or just collapse on
Yeah.
you a couple weeks after you buy it.
Well, I would lean towards you could sell a so-called death trap as long as you're upfront about it. If you lie or hide these facts, then that would be fraud. But I mean, I could easily be swayed to be like, okay, well, unsafe housing creates a risk for everyone. It could
Yeah.
catch on fire and spread really easily,
Or
something like
like,
that.
for children that wouldn't be at fault if their parents made a poor decision and didn't do their due diligence to make sure that the building was up to snuff, and they move into an apartment complex that collapses.
Mhm.
Those children are not, I mean, you wouldn't say that they're responsible, but
Right. Or you leave just a big hole somewhere and kids start falling into it.
yeah, so there's
Yeah.
all kinds of little things that I think
Mhm.
regulations are very important for protecting those like children or innocents that you wouldn't find them responsible to be able to make the kind of decision to avoid those dangers on their own.
Yeah.
You would need some sort of code or compliance to make sure that those dangers are kept away from children or things.
Yeah. Like an anarcho-capitalist would say the market can figure all of that out on its own. The market will self-regulate to make everything safe because they don't want to lose money, because unsafe products make customers feel unsafe and they won't buy those products. I don't think I would go that far.
So this kind of goes along
But
with something that I find very common in conservatives is this. I mean, as a fellow atheist, I maybe you can understand this, but when people talk about the market, to me, it literally sounds like they're describing a god, like the invisible hand of the market that's doing all these things, and it's benevolent, and it can create the best outcomes. And it sounds to me like it's a substituted, like it's a secular religious belief in the market. I mean, it's called market fundamentalism as an ideology. And I mean, do you
I
think
think
that the market is some kind of panacea for the world's problems, or do you think it has its limits, or what are those?
for some people, definitely, because there is also scientism where people just have this vague idea of science. Science will take care of it. But unlike a god, there actually is we can point to markets and see how they actually operate. So, but there is a line. Some people do actually do I would agree. Treat it like a god where that can solve any problem. Um, and a thing I was going to mention before is like safety regulations. I kind of inherently, in principle, have less of a problem with because one, that it's about safety and that's necessary to even have a society, but two, there's way less potential for corruption there, whereas some of the financial regulations have much more potential for corruption because you can use it to crush good actors and help the bad actors. Like of course doctors should have much more rigorous regulation because they can hurt people if they a lot more, but and defraud people a lot more easily.
So can
But having licensure for hair cutting hair, that's unnecessary, and that only hurts poor people who might want to just pop up a hair shop and just not want to deal with months of bureaucracy and bills that they have to go through for licensure. Things like that, I think, just help big business. If we're going to stay with hair cutting, it'll help big business hair shops and keep out just normal everyday mom and pop people from just popping into the market. You would have to have more capital to get into the market and more time and maybe
So
even
to me,
connections.
it sounds like you're more in favor of reforming like regulations rather than like, I mean, you're not advocating for no financial regulations. You're advocating for sensible financial regulations that cut out loopholes that like Wall Street is taking advantage of or something, which I mean,
Mhm.
obviously I would agree with. I think that that's a leftist position, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I come at this from the position that I think the free market as an actually free entity is going to be better for uh, poverty, or is going to help people in poverty, and is going to hurt the big businesses and the corporations because they have it set up. They have all the regulations set up in their favor already, and
So
I
I'll
don't
just
I
lay
don't
out.
see it as a free market as a
So
free
far,
market
Nick,
currently.
it sounds like, I mean, to me, honestly, it sounds like a lot of your prescriptions are more progressive left than libertarian because
Well, I
agree with a lot of your prescriptions. I mean, one of my biggest issues is lobbying. I mean, I
mhm,
do not, I'm
mhm,
not a fan of corruption. I mean, I view lobbying as essentially legalized corruption,
yeah,
and I'm not a fan of lobbying. I think that that needs to be heavily reformed, and I consider that to be a progressive stance.
yeah, campaign finance law
Yeah.
too. And I started off hardcore left. Like I was a vehement anti-capitalist for years. I was a avowed communist. Um,
So
and
let
I
me ask
kind
you
of
then, what do you actually like? What government institutions are you in favor of getting rid of? Maybe we can understand from there. Like, for example, like the Department of Education. Do you think we should have public education?
um yeah, probably. Although
You guess you're not
see,
sounding like a libertarian to me, Snake. Honestly, I don't want to say like you're not what you say you are,
well,
but like I
well
know many
the
libertarians
libertarian
in
part,
favor of public education.
well, I'll tell you why I say that is because I think that laws should be based on the principle of liberty, which is so personal autonomy. So drug laws, get rid of those because that's, I mean, one, it causes a bunch of crime to have illegal
That's
drugs.
another leftist progressive position too.
Right,
I would
yeah,
also agree with you
but
and be
it reduces big government. And it's this war on drugs is a boon for the police and
okay. So I
for
agree.
big business.
So I agree that there are left libertarians and right libertarians. So I can agree with that. I mean, libertarianism is actually started in socialist circles. So I mean, I can agree that you can be a left-leaning libertarian or a right-leaning libertarian. I'm just, I mean, so I'm a big fan of education. I think more education the better. And
Mhm.
there's another. So we've almost hit on my three most important issues, which are education, anti-lobbying, and the third one is the natural environment. And that's something that I'm very curious because from my point of view, the market is wholly insufficient on for addressing issues with the environment, or like specifically with climate change, or something like that? Do you feel that you need to have government regulations to prevent do you need an EPA?
Possibly, although I think you might be able to cut out the APA and just kind of put it under what is the umbrella of just public protection, health protection, because one, poisoning the government hurts people, but also it's hurting their access to the commons. And how do you get stuff if not having access to the commons, and fusing your labor with it? And that's how you get property.
It seems like a very anthropocentric way to approach the idea that we should care for, look after, do no harm to the natural environment.
Yeah, I mean, I personally would like to preserve nature and
Okay,
that.
so that's
But
good.
I would say that
we agree on a lot.
non-human organisms have less rights than us. We have the right to take and destroy and commodify lots of kinds of organisms, although I would probably, as much as I like bacon, I think I would have to kind of logically say, pigs probably have rights, dogs have rights. Not as much as people
So
are as
in,
humans, but because
in
I
a,
would consider dogs people. But
so far, I haven't been able to figure out what you'd actually like to cut out of government, because so far we've got military, we've got healthcare, we've got looking after the environment, and we've got regulations for infrastructure and finance and food and drugs, and what I mean, that's almost everything, except maybe, do you want to cut like social security or Medicare, or I mean, what other areas of government are you are you trying to trim? I mean, if basically what you're describing is that the majority of our current government is the minimally necessary amount of government, is what it sounds like.
so it's not so much about whole cloth getting rid of entire institutions, but it's a kind of more about shrinking all of them. All of them are bloated, I would say, or at least most of them. And so I'm not sure if there's one or multiples that I would get rid of entirely, but I think most of them need shrinking. And I would prefer things be solved by the market. So I think if government intervention is necessary, I think that also market action and competition is also necessary. I think the market does contribute to helping the environment because it gives us new technologies with which to apply perhaps even government action to that. And people seem to like buying eco-friendly things, even if maybe the eco-friendliness is kind of hyped up and not really all it's cracked up to be. So, but
And then I'll say a third thing or a fourth thing at this point, the issues that are very important to me, right? A fourth one I would say is science generally. And it seems like the vast majority of science is funded by the government and not by the market. And that if it was left alone to the market, actually, we wouldn't have nearly as much scientific advances as we currently have. Like, think about the Large Hadron Collider. The market is not going to build the Large Hadron Collider. That's, what, $7 billion for essentially no marketable benefit. I mean, the only benefit for that is to increase our knowledge of the universe, or I mean, almost all scientific studies are funded by, governmental agencies, like Zach Hancock points out right here, like the NSF and NIH. And it seems like government funding is absolutely a necessity for scientific advancement, because without it, I mean, I don't. I mean, think about the invention of radio waves. The guy that invented radio waves said that he doesn't know of any practical application. He invented them, but he couldn't see any practical application for radio waves. Obviously, there were, but if it was just purely market driven, then there would not have been an incentive to invent them at that time. So it seems to me that there are things that the market just is not capable of doing or addressing. Climate change being probably the most important one at the moment, which I don't think that the market can solve without millions and millions of deaths.
Yeah, I'm not seeing much in the way of governments being able to solve it either. But to go back
You
to
think that the
the
governments could solve climate change? I mean, that's gonna. I mean, I would think that that would be like the only.
I mean, what are they going to do? Like, just stop production of oil?
You can fund green energy resources or subsidize green energy. That's one
Okay.
government approach that could
Well,
actually help wean civilizations off of fossil fuels. And you
yeah.
can also have move government funds to direct carbon capture plants that can just take the carbon out of the air. There's no market incentive to have an entire factory that all it does is take in carbon and store it. You can't monetize that, but you can have a government pay it and just directly take greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere.
So I would lean away from subsidizing active industries, but subsidizing research is fine. And to go back to the tax question, I think most of taxes is kind of wasted in bloat, and we don't know where it goes. It usually kind of ends up in the hands of weapons manufacturers and corrupt officials, things like that. And so I think we need more
I don't
trans.
think that our government necessarily works in by taking taxes and using taxes to pay for things. I mean, we run based on fiat currency. We don't need to tax in order to pay for things. That's not how our government currently works. But
Well, yeah, and that's why the dollar is losing its powers, because they just print money that
well,
doesn't
that's the
exist.
way it's been for 60 years, and the dollar is very strong relative to other currencies. So I'm not sure if that narrative necessarily holds weight.
I think it's more of a bubble situation. Because you can't just inflate the currency and just expect it to hold value forever.
Well,
It has to have some
inflation.
grounding in something. There
A
has
healthy 2% inflation is the target for the Federal Reserve. So, okay, there's another question. I
I'd
would
get rid of the
assume,
Fed.
wait, what?
I'd get rid of the Federal Reserve.
We finally found something you'd get
Yeah.
rid of. I thought it might be the
Yeah.
Federal Reserve. So
Yeah.
then, are you okay with just having unregulated boom and bust cycles of speculative markets? Because that's pretty much what you get without centralized banks, right?
I mean, that's what we have now.
Well, they're managed by centralized banks so that they don't swing too much, right?
But who's getting managed? It's just the people get poorer and the rich get richer.
Well, I would argue that that is the inevitable outcome of any libertarian system, right? Because we see that what grows wealth inequality is more laissez-faire economics, right? I mean, anytime, and we can look at that with the rise of neoliberalism since the 70s, we can look at to what degree countries adopted neoliberal approaches, meaning like more free market as the goal. And we can look at how that impacted wealth inequality. And we can see that the more you go, the more hands off the government gets, the more that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. That's what I think that the historical record shows pretty well for the last 50 years. And then in the Gilded Age before that, the lowest that we had, the lowest wealth inequality that we had was just when we had a very high marginal tax rate on the wealthiest people, the highest income groups.
So I'm not looking at inequality or inequality so much as just like the bottom. What is the lowest end of poverty? Because if all ships are rising, I don't really care if some of the ships are a million miles ahead.
If proportionally the distance is getting farther and farther from the 1% that's the farthest ahead, and the percent that's the farthest behind is growing at a bigger and bigger percentage of people, That you don't think that that's problematic for civilization?
Well, as long as the bottom percent is doing fine, not really.
So, I mean, currently in this country, the bottom percent is only able to get by
Yeah.
government programs. So
Yeah.
if the government cut those programs like food stamps that subsidize like Walmart employees or something, or you cut Social Security and Medicare, which, I mean, by the way, I think something like a third of all like poverty was cut out of the what was brought over the poverty line from Social Security, Medicare. So that seems to be good if you're interested in reducing the suffering of the poor. It seems like you don't want libertarian policies, which would result in more suffering for the poor. I would wager. It seems like what you would want are more left progressive policies. If that's the outcome that you're seeking, is overall less suffering and a greater quality of life for the most amount of people.
I think generally welfare is a band-aid that kind of ends up being paradoxical and making the problem worse, and then people are completely dependent on it, and then they need more welfare, and
So are you
it's
just
something.
rejecting the numbers then that show that the number of people living below the poverty line has permanently decreased since the Great Society policies?
The people living under the poverty line has decreased since.
Yes,
Well,
since we
okay,
did
so
Social Security and Medicare, I mean, the amount of elderly living in poverty has radically permanently diminished since Social Security was enacted.
yeah,
It
and
seems like a very
but that's the
successful policy.
problem with having like a multivariate analysis of just okay, there's a lot more problems than just we're not sending these people checks every month.
Yeah.
There's a reason why these people are poor in the first place, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the markets are so heavily regulated and
Do you think
people
that
aren't
maybe
and people are too highly taxed, so they don't have any money.
so here before you go off on that, let's just consider, right, the Gilded era of, the 1870s to the 1900s,
Well, I'm not saying that
where
was
you
perfect
had
either.
significantly less regulation and you had significantly less taxes and you had some of the greatest amount of poverty that America has ever seen, and you had some of the highest concentrations of wealth in the smallest amount of hands that we've seen in our history. So it seems to me like there is no correlation here between regulations and taxes, except that when you had the least amount of people in poverty and you had the least amount of people with a ridiculous amount of money concentrated in the 1% was when we had the highest marginal tax rates. And we had a lot of regulation in the 50s as well. So it seems to me like the correlation goes the opposite way, and that actually what happens whenever you cut taxes and regulation is that inevitably what happens is that more money is concentrated in the hands of less amount of people at the top, and that the poor suffer more. That's what seems to be supported by the data and the history, at least in my reading of it.
Well, there are correlations, but I don't think you can draw causation because it seems like it's kind of a feedback loop where the poor get poorer and need more help, and so we give them more help and take more money to do that. Meanwhile, the rich still don't really pay taxes. They're barely ever paying taxes.
So we should close
And
those loopholes, right?
of course.
Okay, so that again, I'm hearing more left progressive policies from you, Snake. I don't know, like, I mean, I guess
Well,
you're a
I mean, I do want to cut.
Fed. For wanting to
Yeah.
keep central banks, I will agree. That to me sounds like a very libertarian
Well,
position.
I don't identify as right libertarian.
Huh?
I don't identify as like right libertarian.
Okay.
So, I would say if you want to ascribe left wing to that, that's fine with me. I come from the left. I say I left the left because it's a little bit crazy right now, but that's where I'm and coming from, and I criticize the left because I feel like that's my side. I've never been right wing. I don't like conservative thinking.
Okay.
I think that they're
So let me ask you. I mean, you don't have to divulge who you voted for or anything, but I want to ask, like, do you vote third party or do you suck it up and vote for the lesser of two evils in general elections? Or do you vote at all?
It just depends.
Because
I've been voting third party a lot.
to me, I think
I couldn't vote for Hillary or Biden.
I think that that's wild because to me, if you're a person who is in favor of protecting the natural environment and mitigating climate change and promoting science, there's only one option there. I mean, there's one side that acknowledges the science of climate change and is willing to fund scientific research. And then there's the other side that denies that climate change is real, denies the science, and cuts funding to the sciences. And it's like,
yeah, I don't like that side either.
I know, but just if the choice is between those sides, I think that it's really obvious that which one you should vote for, right?
But that trap is what I'm against, and that's my number one issue is I'm not going to buy into this trap of evil of giant douche or turd sandwich. I think that that's our number one issue should be getting away from that bullshit choice. I think the bigger issue is about trust in government and the corruption of government. And if you just always suck it up and just kind of go with the choices that they hand you, you're letting them take the democracy away from you and letting the corruption take over. So
but at a certain point,
I want ranked choice voting. I want reforms like that.
I can agree with ranked choice voting.
Yeah,
I can agree with
most people do.
I can agree with not having a two-party system and having a more multi-party democracy. I think those are all good things. But at the end of the day, I think you have to be a realist and actually just look at the outcomes. Again, for climate change and the environment and science and education and the things that seem to be important to you, it really, I can't understand either not voting or voting a third party between those two options. I cannot rationalize that from a sane perspective. It sounds like
I don't trust that the Democrats are going to do anything about it. They'll give lip service to it.
But they have,
maybe
haven't they?
A little bit more than the Republicans, but
so Biden's Inflation Reduction Act is the most impactful climate policy that the U.S. has ever done. I mean, for climate change, for mitigating climate change, that is the most that the government has ever done in the U.S. history. I mean, is that not doing anything? I mean, that sounds like a pretty good, pretty good outcome if you care about something like the environment.
I would have to read up on that policy specifically, but
here, yeah, Dan is talking about from Creation Myths is talking about it in the comments here. Like the Biden passed the largest climate bill ever. It's already had a huge impact. Texas has doubled its solar output in 1 year. I mean, there are tangible effects from the Inflation Reduction Act and all that money going towards green energy sources, going towards energy efficiency, going towards reducing our emissions. Funding science. I mean, for example, that breakthrough in nuclear fusion that happened, I think last year, that was a direct result of Biden. That lab did not have the funding to operate their nuclear fusion device. Trump had cut their funding. They were no longer even operational. Biden increased their funding, as he did for most branches of science. And then they were able to restart up their lab and have a major breakthrough in nuclear fusion. I mean, it just seems like if the things that you value are the natural environment, education, and science, there is just one option, and voting third party just hurts all the things you actually care about. It seems like these principles and your ideology might be preventing you from making a sane, rational decision. To me, that's how I'm reading this.
Well, it's just that I have a bigger issue, which is corruption in government. And I think that both parties are the party of
there's lots of corruption on both
corruption
sides.
and war. And yeah, I think, and I'm not saying there's good things that can come from it that I can agree with, but my decision making is more, I feel like long term, we're going down this corruption hole that's not acceptable. And I
So
think we need
I
to,
agree. We should do like lobbying reforms. We should have
yeah,
campaign finance reforms. We should close loopholes. Try everything we can to put in government regulations to mitigate and minimize corruption. But
yeah. But
again, that
and
doesn't
I
sound like
follow,
a libertarian stance. That sounds like a progressive left stance.
well, I follow your line of logic, like what's the more practical of the two evils. But I think that's kind of a short-term thinking for my most important issue. And like I mentioned, the war part of it is both parties are very much into starting wars to make profits for Lockheed Martin and
Sure.
and themselves. And I think that these people need to be sent a message that we're not going to let you stay in power. And I think that's more important right now than almost anything else.
So, as someone, you said that you come from the left and you consider the left your side. So then, if you don't vote for the people actually making leftist policies about the things you care about, like the environment and science, then it seems like what you're effectively doing, like in reality, I get that you're making a principled stand and that you're standing by your ideological principles, but from a practical outcome, it sounds like what you're doing is hurting the ability to get the policies that you actually want, because you know that third party is just throwing away your vote in all practical, like in all practical functionality of it. I mean,
Well, it's a protest.
yeah, so
So,
you understand that it has no practical benefit for anybody, and it's only hurting the actual chances that you get policies that you actually want.
well, my vote, if I voted for Biden, my state would have still gone Biden, or if whether I did or not, and Biden would still be elected. So I actually feel like I'm making more impact by adding to the protest vote, because most people are just going to vote what a Republican or Democrat anyway. But I think it's more important to make a stink about our election options, our just the corruption in general that we've been talking about, and
So it's more important to vocalize your disdain for both parties than it is to try to effectively push for the actual policies that you want through the most effective means of doing so. Because
because
it seems like the most effective way for you to push those policies is to push the Democrats in the direction you want, rather than to try to protest both parties, which doesn't really send that strong of a signal unless you're saying I support libertarian policies, which really it sounds like you support way more left progressive policies than you support libertarian policies on mass. When you
well, libertarians are split on a lot of stuff, but I definitely support more left wing stuff than right wing stuff, if you want
and
to put it
your
in those terms.
protest vote doesn't signal any of that nuance at all. I mean, you're nobody can understand what the vote for the Libertarian Party means. I mean, it basically, like, most
Well, I don't
libertarians
always vote libertarian.
dissolving, like
I voted Green Party.
dissolving the education department, all these things. I mean,
I
it
voted
sounds like,
Green Party in 2016, but
okay, well, I mean, again, I think, you know, functionally, you're not going to get anything out of that. That's only going to hurt the things that you actually prioritize. Because, I mean, if you,
well,
if you prioritize your number one goal, I guess, is not the natural environment or science or education, but your number one goal is anti-war and anti-corruption, then I don't see libertarians putting forth any anti-corruption policies other than just dissolving branches of government. I have seen Democrats like Elizabeth Warren actually putting forward anti-corruption, anti-insider trading legislation and campaign finance reform. I have seen the Democratic left actually putting forward policies like that you could be supporting, that seem to align with your goals for mitigating corruption. I see more of your priorities on the left. I also see a lot of anti-war in both. I mean, the very far right and on the left, there you can find anti-war pockets. I don't think you need to be supporting the Libertarian Party to push for policy outcomes on those fronts. Like, just if you look at the things that you are prioritizing as your important issues, it doesn't make sense to me rationally why you would be throwing your vote away on a protest.
Well, I'm not libertarian in terms of like capital L libertarian member of the Libertarian Party. That's just kind of where I stand ideologically. But I have voted libertarian here and there. I don't think for president. I might have voted for Elizabeth Warren. She's better than a lot of them. But I don't see the ability to move the Democrats really in a substantive way because it is so corrupt. So I think that we'll get crumbs here and there. But until this corruption is dealt with, I think that all we're going to get is crumbs. And it's going to be too little too late for issues like climate change. And we don't see Democrats doing anything about the drug war, really, at least on the
realistically
national scale.
Just realistically speaking, what do you think is the most realistic way that we can get policy outcomes to address this corruption issue, which seems to be like your biggest issue? What, in your mind, how is a protest vote going to help bring about that outcome?
Hopefully they'll stop running candidates like Joe Biden, like entrenched political candidates that are part of just the corrupt legacy, and start running alternative people.
So do you think Trump helped our levels of corruption? Because Trump is an outside person. He's not an establishment candidate. I don't think that he helped positively mitigate corruption in government at all.
Trump's an interesting case in a lot of ways. I think he helped raise the issue and awareness in a way, but in another way, I think he stopped a lot of progress because now everyone's just focused on how he's rude and an asshole and, probably corrupt as well. And
I mean,
and unstable and uneducated.
Giuliani were literally selling pardons, right?
Sure, Giuliani is part of this corrupt establishment as well.
So
they all got to go, pretty much.
It sounds like you're effectively not painting any realistic path forward, because that there is no realistic scenario in which libertarians are voted into office. Like, that's not going to happen, realistically speaking. So it sounds like
that's the problem. That they're able to
I understand you have a problem with reality, but that is the reality. It's not going to happen.
The fact that they're able to control our options to such a degree is spiraling out into so many different problems. That's one of my number one issues.
I understand reality is not the way you would like it to be, but I'm trying to just think of a realistic scenario that could possibly bring about what you would like, which is less corruption. And it sounds to me like the most realistic scenario for that is to push the Democrats to the left on that issue and to get them to do reforms, because I don't think it's realistic for the Republicans to do those reforms. And I
would if I could
to get libertarians in those positions.
I was stumping for Bernie so hard.
Okay.
But then we saw that the Democrat Party cheated him out of the election.
I mean, if Bernie got more votes, I think he would have gotten in. I don't know. I mean, I can say that, they tried to weigh this.
They actually manipulated things behind the scenes so that he couldn't. And they used the media to make him look like the crazy
I don't think that they put their finger on their scale maybe, but I don't think that it was unrealistic that Bernie could have won. I don't think it was impossible for him if he had gotten enough votes. And I think that it is worth it to try to continue that work instead of giving up because Bernie didn't win. I think it's worth it to continue to press and continue to try to push.
Yeah, and I'm
for
not against that
like
in any principle, but it depends. There are some candidates that are just too corrupt for me to vote for along party lines. There are some like Bernie. You know, I've got problems with Bernie. I think he's too socialist, and I'm a huge anti-socialist, but I think that overall he would have been pushing things in
so
most things in
wait,
the right
wait.
direction.
You're anti-socialist, but you're pro public education, pro socialized healthcare, pro socialized defense. I assume, socialized fire departments. I mean, it sounds like you're in favor of some socialism, but
But that's not it's a spectrum. It's not either socialism or capitalism.
I agree. It's a spectrum.
And fire departments and police and militaries are not socialism. Socialism is the abolition of private property.
Well, it is, you are socializing those goods like the fire department. I mean, it is supported and owned socially, like the public good. The fire department serves everybody. You don't have to pay them to use it. It's not market based. So I think, and socialized medicine the same way. You said that the government has a responsibility to protect the health of its people. So that sounds like socialized medicine to me. So it sounds like you are in favor of socialism in certain areas and you're more for the market in others. But again, this doesn't sound like a libertarian position to me, but it also sounds like, it honestly sounds like Joe Biden is pushing for the issues and the policies that you prioritize. You're not getting everything that you want. Obviously, I'm not saying that, Joe Biden is a perfect angel and that he's not corrupt in any way or there's nothing going on there. But I mean, he ended the war in Afghanistan. He's reduced a lot of the drone combat that was so prevalent in Obama and Trump. So there's at least some anti-war going on there. Maybe you don't like what's going on with support for Ukraine, but I think you're getting a lot of what you want, especially in regards to the environment, climate change, education, and science, which I think that are important issues to you. So like, if on the one hand, you're getting a certain percentage of what you want with with Biden, you're getting very little of what you want with Trump, and you're getting absolutely nothing of what you want with voting third party. Like, you get no functional outcome or benefit from that in any way. Again, when I go back to thinking about this rationally, the decision seems very clear.
But it's not like my vote has any impact. Our state is went Biden anyway. So I can actually make more impact as a protest vote because that will actually be more, that will show up more in the numbers. And it will be more noticeable in the sense of like, look at everyone who's just not playing along with the game anymore, even though most people are still going along with what would have happened anyway. But yeah, I mean, he's pushing for the war to intensify in Ukraine and not peacefully resolve it. He still has the war in Yemen. Like, Afghanistan was a disaster and just kind of a lip service token to ending wars.
Except it actually did end that involvement, right?
Well, the war was over, and then it just let ISIS take over
you mean the Taliban?
Taliban.
We did withdraw though, and we're no longer involved in that conflict. And
yeah, we just made it
war zone anymore, right?
We just made it worse on the votes of people like Biden and Hillary, who haven't learned their lessons at all.
So,
and that's what, like, I'm not American centric. Like,
you're saying you don't want war.
We destroyed this entire region completely.
So wait.
So we can't have that anymore. I'm not willing to trade those people's lives for a little bit.
I get it.
Towards better, like solar panels.
I want to get this straight. were you in favor of withdrawing from Afghanistan and ending our involvement in that conflict, or were you in favor of staying there to try and resolve the situation with a better outcome? Because those were the only two options. I mean, if you're anti-war, you're anti-war, right? You would want us to get out of that and end that war. So it sounds like Biden just did exactly what you wanted him to do, but you still aren't happy.
In the worst way possible. It's a tricky situation because we're already there. The biggest mistake was already made, which was going in there in the
Sure.
first place. There's not a good exit strategy at all, period.
Okay. So then
But I think
he
we
did
had
what
one
you
of the
wanted.
worst.
So then
What?
he did what he wanted. He did what you wanted. If there's no good exit strategy, but he pulled the trigger and got out, then how is that not what you wanted?
Well, because there's 10 other wars going on that we're still involved in.
Right, but one less is what you wanted, right? I mean, that's again, I said you're not going to get 100% of what you want, but you're getting a percentage of what you want. That's better than no percentage of what you want.
But I mean, the way it was done was actually made things worse. But it's about the principles of these institutions that are controlling us. Yeah, okay, they ended one war, started 3 more. They're
Okay, which
still.
three did he start?
I'm just talking in the
Well, I don't think
general.
Biden started the Ukraine war, so I don't think. I mean, if he didn't start that war, which war did he start? It just won.
Well, is he responsible for any of the war in that his administration pushed them to not take to encourage Ukraine to not take the peace accords?
You mean like encourage them not to like give in to giving their territory to Putin?
No, there were agreements to.
Do you know the conditions for those peace accords?
Well,
Where
the original ones was to not invade it in the first place, and
wait, what are you talking about with this?
the first Minsk Accords that
Okay,
was, yeah.
and so that was before Biden, those first Minsk accords.
Yeah, but I'm looking. These are people are all part of the same administration.
So okay, but you think that the policy that you would have liked was for Ukraine to just accept the loss of its territory for the means of preserving peace and just let either Russia make puppet states out of them or claim them entirely. That's what you wish that Biden would have done.
So at this point, I think it would be better to have a ceasefire, even if Russia ends up with territories, because that's less dead people. And that's less bombing of city
So,
centers
do you
and
think that in any way?
people having no water and power.
So, if we think about the outcomes of such a decision in terms of broader geopolitical context, what kind of message do you think that sends to maybe governments that maybe they've been eyeing a bit of contested territory with their neighbors, but they didn't want to do anything because they didn't want allies to step in and prevent them from conquering territory? You know, China with Taiwan, any number of dictatorships or authoritative regimes that may have been eyeing potential, that land just across the border is looking pretty nice, pretty productive economically, looking pretty tempting. Do you think that in any way, if Russia was to get away with it, that might tempt further geopolitical destabilization and conquest and invasions elsewhere in the world?
Well, with Russia, they actually there were regions of the Ukraine that voted to cede into Russia, and Putin denied their requests basically. And so with Russia, I don't think it was just a conquest motivation. I think it's more of they're afraid that NATO is encroaching. I don't agree with their decisions or anything, but it is the natural conclusion that they've
Wait, so
come to.
you don't think hold on, wait. Okay, so you don't think that Russia is doing this for I mean, you don't think that they're doing this in order to gain more territory, um, or like to increase their cultural sphere or whatever.
No,
I'm curious why you think that Putin would have rejected that request, because to me, the rational decision why Putin would reject that request is because he knew that it would start a war. And he thought it was geopolitically untenable to start a war at that point in time. And so because he knew if he accepted their request, that would start a war, and he didn't want a war to start at that time. Rationally, to me, that makes sense. Even if he did actually want that territory to be part of Russia in an ideal world, I mean, he wants that territory to be Russian, but he knows, I mean, he's smart enough to know that it would start a war and would have consequences that he didn't want to deal with at the time. That is rational to me for why he would reject their request there.
Well, I mean, I can't really speculate on that, but I think what happened is basically they're losing control of a lot of their industries in Europe, like the oil industry is being their ability to sell oil is essentially being legislated or traded away from. So they had to act and do something. And I
But
I totally condemn the way that they acted, but
at the time when Russia invaded, were their oil exports to Europe not at an all-time high percentage-wise? I mean, it seems like it
I'm
was at
not
an
sure,
all-time high.
but it's been getting threatened. Like Germany was trying to get off Russian oil,
But
and
except Germany just accepted Nord Stream 2 pipeline to import even more Russian oil. I really don't see this as being reflective of reality. Like, they were heavily dependent on Russian oil, and it didn't seem like they were on any track to lessen that dependence until the invasion of Ukraine.
yeah, I think that they're defending their economic interests that they have because they're relying on that. I don't think it's driven by this mad lust for just having more land.
So you don't think that Russia annexed Crimea to get more land?
Just for the psychological satisfaction of having a larger country? No.
Well, no. I mean, there are obviously benefits to having more land. Like, there's economic benefits to having more land,
I
especially,
think
I mean,
it's
when you consider that the regions that they are fighting over in eastern Ukraine are some of the most productive agricultural areas in the world. I mean,
mm,
the breadbasket of that entire region, there's a huge economic incentive for Russia to conquer this territory.
economic, yeah, not just in farming, but again for the oil, but the I lost my train of thought. Military as well because they feel threatened by because it's actually really hard to defend a
Hold
lot
on
of
just
inner
one
Russia.
second with that, Snake. Sorry, I just have to address. There's a climate denier in chat who says humans cannot influence the climate. Dems want you to think if you vote for them, you get rid of bad weather. They're playing off people's poor logic. Ace philosophy. Please look up stratospheric cooling. You cannot explain stratospheric cooling, which has been observed, without the greenhouse effect, without human driven climate change. Stratospheric cooling, those are two words that completely debunk your position. Until you can explain to me what causes stratospheric cooling, you are debunked and you're spewing a bunch of pseudoscientific nonsense. So please look it up, read about it, and figure out why you're wrong. Sorry about that, Snake.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, I at least
If you
agree. I'm glad that we can at least agree on climate change. That is supported by the science and is a big issue.
Yeah, I don't see how you can deny that pumping trillions of tons of carbon into the atmosphere isn't going to change the composition of the atmosphere a
Yeah.
little bit. Um,
Especially since we know on literally a molecular level how greenhouse gases work and
mhm.
how they contribute to a hotter climate, and there's just so much evidence. It's really beyond me that anyone can deny this, but I have noticed that the people that deny it the most are conservatives and libertarians.
Conservatives, libertarians, the discussions I've seen around that, and I kind of started leaning towards that is, and I'll explain, is that while there is human created climate change, it's best to let developing countries like India kind of go through their industrial phase and to not regulate them to produce less, to burn less fossil fuels, and let them go through the industrial phase until they can get to the point where they can create green technology. Then it is to like regulate them so that they can't go through these phases of economic development that will actually help the poor people. So, I'm kind of on the fence about it, but I've heard some pretty good arguments for that case of like, okay, the environment can take a little bit of a hit so that we can get to the point where we can start, where everyone globally can start having green technology. Because otherwise, like if you ban fossil fuels, this is an extreme example, but if you just stop having fossil fuels, people will, like millions of people will just die. So I think
So the
that's
way
a crisis as much as climate change killing people as well.
So the path forward is to have the government speed up what would happen in a market-based system. What would end up happening is you would have runaway climate change. The poorest people in the world would be the most effective and would suffer the most and would cause millions of deaths. Meanwhile, most of the countries actually contributing the most greenhouse gases would be mostly able to weather the storm and wouldn't have that much of an issue. And they wouldn't have much of a market-based incentive to improve the system because it's not them that are suffering the most. The problem for them would be the refugee system, like crisis that would be occurring from those countries. And their incentive at that point would be for the right-wing authoritarians to take control and militarize their borders and start shooting refugees. That seems to be like the inevitable outcome for a more market-based solution to this. Again, because I mean, the market just isn't going to be able to address a global issue on this scale. At least, I can't understand how that would be plausible. It sounds like what you would need to actually combat this is to have governments invest in green technologies, develop more efficient technologies, more green technologies, and then export those to developing markets once you have reached the technological point where you can produce those technologies cheaply. That seems to be the most effective path forward.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily disagree with that.
Well, that's not.
I think funding research over funding operating industries is more the way to go.
You think what?
I think it's better to subsidize research versus subsidize industries that are already operating.
So the issue,
and once
there,
the
right,
research is done, let it release into the market.
the issue there is that the market's just not fast enough, right? There's still an economic incentive to go with the short-term profits, which would be the cheapest solution now, even though that would cause more economic or more environmental pollution and greenhouse gas emissions because it's cheaper now. But if you subsidize the green technologies, you can bring down the price so you can catalyze a market takeover of the actual green technology as it gets cheaper, like over the decades. Then you don't need to subsidize it as much, but you need some sort of catalyst to make sure that the green transition happens in a time scale that fits with the science of what the actual environment needs. So the market, I just don't think, is capable of addressing this fast enough in order to avoid millions of deaths.
I think there's room for that, but I think we need to keep a pretty careful eye on that because subsidizing also encourages a lot of corruption. Like, for example, when they were subsidizing railroads, the companies that were getting subsidies built railways that would curve and so that they could keep building and keep getting more money from the government. So there was a lot of waste going on, and it was actually slower than the companies that weren't receiving subsidies, and they were more efficient and used less resources. So I'm not against that in principle, but I just, as a libertarian, I think we need to again keep a close eye on that and try and make sure everything have is like where I would want the government to be biggest is to have institutions that are actually in some way able to limit the other institutions of the government.
So, on the topic of the railroads, right? Um, it seems to me that roads, railroads, internet, all these things would not be capable under a market based system to reach rural communities. It seems like you need a government to fund that, right?
Okay, and again, I'm not an anarchist. I think the government can do some things.
Well, you were saying, like, as a libertarian, and you were then saying, I don't think the government should be subsidizing things as a libertarian, but then you are okay with them subsidizing rural infrastructure because
Well, no, I mean
you have to.
the lens that I'm looking at it through is to always be put on priority, looking out for corruption and waste.
Okay. Do you think interesting. So
And not to be in principle against government spending. That's not what I mean.
okay. So then it sounds like you're just in favor of regulations that mitigate waste and corruption.
Yeah, I mean, like I'm very in favor of regulations of the government itself.
Okay, so that's not a libertarian position, is it? I mean, libertarians just want to
Yeah,
minimize government. You're advocating for more government regulation.
of the government, which would be shrinking the government in a sense. If you're regulating how much power the government has,
More government regulation is, in a sense, shrinking the government. I don't think many
no
libertarians agree with you.
regulation of the government,
Okay.
putting limitations on the government.
Um. So you're in favor of more government regulations on the government, but I mean, we already agreed that you're in favor of several government regulations on private industry as well, like finance, infrastructure. You got to make sure that your bridges aren't going to collapse, right?
Yeah, in terms of public safety and fraud and assault and violence, aggression, all of that needs to be regulated in some way. And yeah, I'm in favor of that.
So I'm really at this point,
That's what.
I'm just surprised that you consider yourself a libertarian.
Well, libertarians are against all those things. Aggression and fraud are the two big ones, and it ranges, of course, from people who think the market can just do all of that, and people who think that the market can contribute and help, but the government also, we need to have police and stuff like that.
Um,
And I do believe there are some market forces that help with that, but I don't think it's sufficient.
Okay, so if you're not, you make exceptions for market fundamentalism, which I don't find libertarians doing very often. You're in
Well, it
favor.
depends. There's a lot of difference in thought in libertarians.
That's true. I've never really met two libertarians that agree with each other about their conceptions for libertarianism.
Well, I think that the agreement there is the agreement that, aggression and fraudulent behavior are bad, and the most of the disagreement is kind of how to get rid of that. And so the principle is don't aggress on people. Okay, well, tax is an aggression, but it's probably a necessary one to stop, to be able to fund things like police, to be able to make sure that people aren't aggressive towards each other on the streets. So it's really a question of self-defense. So, and libertarians are fine with that. And they're fine with regulating financial institutions because they don't want them to be defrauding anyone.
So what about libertarianism do you actually think minimizes corruption? Because from my point of view, regardless of the actual size or number of government employees, corruption is still equally possible unless you have effective regulations in place.
So our conception of regulations as they're being used now is that they're being used to help big business and basically try to merge big business and government, which is kind of pseudo-fascist. And so it's not that obviously there's exceptions, but it's not that libertarians are against regulation in principle. They're against using regulation for corruption,
Lots of libertarians are against it in principle. I mean, lots of libertarians are against taxation in principle.
Sure, yeah, and there's exceptions. But in general, the conception is that regulations are being used by the big business to help themselves and to hurt poor people and to drive them into poverty. And
okay, but do you not think that there would be more people living in poverty in a libertarian system? Like a libertarian society would have more people living in poverty, inevitably.
No.
Really? That surprises me because I absolutely see that as a definitive, inevitable outcome.
I come at it from the perspective of I'm trying to reduce poverty and reduce
so then how can you possibly be a libertarian? That does not compute to me.
Because I think that those principles reduce corruption in the system. Because I see people who are all corrupt using the system in their favor. And so how could giving them more power possibly end up in our favor? They would just keep using it in their favor and to tip the scales more and more and more in their favor. So that's the thing.
So
like about the central banks is like, do you really think that there are benevolent people operating these systems, or do you think that they're operating it for their own personal benefit?
Neither. I don't believe in either of those outcomes. But I just want to, because this is my conception of it, okay? If you had your perfect little world, right? If you had, it was all small businesses, there were no big corporations, there were the absolute minimum amount of government as necessary to secure people's rights, whatever. Inevitably, as I conceive of that system, you will have more successful businesses out-competing less successful businesses. Those more successful businesses will then, through mergers and acquisitions, grow in power and scope until eventually you have cartels and monopolies with all the power, and you have more and more wealth concentrated in fewer and fewer hands as an inevitability of that system. I don't see any way around that unless you abandon libertarianism and start regulating the private industry to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, but they don't last in reality. Like, how many of the financial empires are actually still exist from the Gilded Age?
Because they were broken up by the government, by the progressive government. The trust busting anti-monopoly legislation broke those up.
Well, a lot of them, like Vanderbilt, had to break up monopolies to even get into the market in the first place. So, and a lot of these empires were already in decline. Like the Steel Empire was already in decline before all these regulations came up. And that's because of competition comes in. And we've seen that,
But
in the
monopoly
history of
crush
America.
competition in its cradle.
What did you say?
If there's no government preventing monopolies, monopolies can crush potential competition before they are able to develop a competitive edge. They can kill them in the cradle.
Through means generally of regulating, putting in regulations, putting in licensing laws.
No, through
And
economies of scale. That's
they
it.
use,
Clear and simple. These are basic. This is
but
the
it's not
means.
just that.
But
They're passing laws that actually are in their favor.
But even
But
without that, even if they didn't
right,
have any laws, they could still crush any potential competition just purely based on laissez-faire economics. I
but
mean,
we
once
don't
you have
actually
a
see that.
monopoly,
Like, how do you compete with McDonald's? Well, I don't know. Chick-fil-A started with one store and now they're bigger than McDonald's. Well, I don't know about that, but they're at least
because McDonald's doesn't have a monopoly. I mean, we're talking about monopolies here, which I see monopolies as an inevitable outcome of libertarian economic policies. Like, unless there are government procedures to prevent the rise of monopolies, I think that they're inevitable in any free market system.
well, unless they're pretty much perfect, they're eventually going to crumble. And if they're doing things well, then it's in
So you're
principle,
okay
I'm
with
not.
monopolies for ruling for potentially decades to like hundreds of years?
If they're doing things well, I don't see much of a problem with it. Um, but the fact that, so if like with health insurance, we're now mandated to buy health insurance. The whole insurance industry is completely messed up. But if consumers have the right to choose, then if they don't like the monopoly, they can just, they like, people can raise capital to create competition. That's how a lot of people do it.
But all the capital is in the hands of the monopoly is always going to have more capital than you can raise as an outsider trying to enter into the market. I mean, you're not going to be able to out capital raise a monopoly.
Well, you could raise enough to enter the market,
but they're always going to have enough capital to crush you. Especially if you're in a libertarian system where there's minimal regulations, they can do some pretty underhanded things to crush you. Like they can just buy your suppliers. Just cut off your supplies to compete. I mean, there's any number of things that they can do in an unregulated market to make it unfair. I mean, I just don't think that if you had your perfect libertarian society, I think it would crumble in a matter of decades. I don't think it's sustainable because I think inevitably you're just going to have, again, just so much power and wealth concentrated into monopolies and like people that own like huge percentages of the market. And inevitably, you're just going to have runaway amounts of poverty and social inequality. That's the inevitable outcome as I see it from these policies.
But that's what we're seeing now.
Because of neoliberalism.
Bigger and bigger.
Because of neoliberalism, which sticks to a free market ideology. They're like the current ideology that was the case since like the late 70s onwards, as a whole in the world, has been free market liberalism. And we've seen the results of that. We see that it's incredibly unhealthy for wealth inequality. And
well, neoliberalism is not libertarianism.
But they subscribe to the same market fundamentalism. Like the ideology behind them is the same. It's market fundamentalism. It's a belief in the free market. And we've seen what that does when it's actually implemented. And we've seen the results are not good.
But so why then do you think that companies are always lobbying the government to help them out? If it's free, why do they get so many bailouts? That's not free market.
Lobbying.
Yeah, that's not free market.
A leftist position to reform lobbying so that, like, get rid of Citizens United, make it so that companies cannot lobby for their own interests. I think that that's not a libertarian position. I think that that's a leftist progressive position.
I mean, to me, it's both.
I
Because
think a
it's
lot
not,
of
I don't,
libertarians are very in favor of corporate lobbying.
like the ones that I read and watch are definitely not. I think that some, there are big business people who describe themselves as libertarians. That's not my kind of libertarian.
Well, all right. I guess we've been going on for over an hour and a half now. I've pretty much I've asked you a lot of the questions that I had intended to ask, and I honestly I don't feel like I have any clearer of a picture of what your ideal libertarian society would look like, other than just like our society with a little bit less bureaucratic red tape and no central banks.
I mean, our society is fairly good already, so I'm not suggesting a complete revolution or anything. I think that our system is being used by all these interests that you think that it's actually limiting and holding back. I think they've totally hijacked the whole system. They have control of it. They can do whatever they want with it, and to think that they're doing it for our benefit, I think, is pretty naive.
Well, I never said that, did I?
Okay, but I don't see where you're disagreeing. Then where's your disagreement with the fact that they're using the system for their benefit, and why would it be better to not give them less of that power?
Well, again, I don't think that the answer is so simple as they're either doing it for their benefit and they're not at all doing it for the benefit of other people. I think that there's a somewhat more nuanced approach to this where obviously politicians are in it for their own benefit personally. I think that's pretty obvious to most people looking at the situation. But politicians are also ideologically driven oftentimes, and they are doing what they think is the correct moves for like in accords with their own ideology. Um, I don't think it's a simple binary as like, oh, they're just entirely self-interest, or like their self-interest cannot overlap with the broader interests of the country or their party or whatever. I think that what is it? Governing dynamics, or there's like a math where everyone is acting in the interest of both themselves and the group as a whole, and you find the middle ground between those, and that's the path
Yeah.
that they
Well,
actually.
I think their group is their class, which is the political, and
Sure.
so they are acting in their own ideological interests. But I think that those interests are the interests of the
I think that their
aristocratic
interests
class.
can overlap to a good degree. Like, for example, you want to be a popular politician. So you want to do stuff that gives you a historical impact. You want to be famous. You want to have a legacy. You want to be in the history books. So you want a good legacy in the history books. So it's within your own interest to do things that will give you a positive entry in history books for doing good things. So
And
they can
then
absolutely overlap for
and
your
then you
own
realize
doing
you
good.
can do that just by saying the right things and just doing the bidding of the unelected officials and the establishment that's already there.
Well, functionally, okay, that can only get you so far. Like if you're not actually doing any good and all you're doing is spewing a bunch of bullshit, then you're not really going to have positive functional impact that are going to make it into history books, and your your legacy is not going to be very good.
Well, I
So
mean, how did Obama get a peace prize?
that's not
By
anything
doing
in
nothing.
history.
What's that?
That happened in the moment. That has nothing to do with how he's going to be regarded in history, which is probably going to be
I
like
mean,
B
that's
tier.
part of it.
I don't think that they're going to be mentioning that in the history books. I mean, I think that they're probably going to be mentioning like his bailout of the banks and his drone warfare and the things he actually did in
Well,
a
it
substantial
depends.
sense.
Yeah, I mean, if we have a future that's more establishment run, then we'll have flowery stuff about him. If we have a future that's more libertarian and concerned with the rights of people, then we're going to have more focus on the wars that he started and
So
the ongoing blockade in Yemen.
Do you really think in any future that this country is going to vote libertarians into office?
In any future, sure.
I really
If people get fed up enough.
I really think that there's almost a 0% chance of that happening.
And I don't even care necessarily about the Libertarian Party. Like, again, it's more about overthrowing the established interests, and people are getting pretty fed up with it, and hopefully that goes somewhere. I don't care if that's the Libertarian Party or not, because I use libertarian as just this focus on looking at every right and every law in the government as, does it protect the liberty of citizens or does it infringe the liberty of the citizens? And I think the classical conception is more of just a consequentialist, like, I guess just consequentialist, and ideological, where it's not consistently principled, where it's like, well, we don't like drugs, so we're just gonna outlaw them. And instead of looking at the principles of, okay, how is this infringing on people's rights? And how is this going to contribute to worse problems like cartels and black markets?
Yeah, and I think doing that kind of analysis should lead you away from libertarian ideology. If you're actually looking at what are the consequences, like what are the outcomes of policies, of libertarian policies, I think doing that kind of analysis and looking at the actual real world what the real world outcomes would be should lead you away from those policies.
Well, not necessarily, because when you're looking at financial, I guess, business regulations, through my lens, you're going to look at it and say, well, is it really justified to take this much money from people that they earned, and it's just going to go who knows where, and only the insiders know? I think there's a lot to do with tax reform. Like, maybe there's a people can actually choose where their taxes go to. And there's an argument for crowdfunding things, but that's a totally different conversation, not to open that can of worms. But looking at things, we want to take as little as possible from people, because we have to recognize that taxation is taking money out of people's hands that they actually earned. And so we have to be responsible with that kind of power.
That kind of goes on an assumption there, though. I think that you're assuming that they earned that in an ethical sense. But I think that that's just an assumption. And I think you could make the same argument against, like, if we were back in medieval times and we were talking about taxing aristocrats, nobles, one of the aristocrats or the nobles would say, well, this is our money. We earned it from taxing our land that we own. It's ours. We earned it by owning this land. And to me, their income, which came from taxing the peasants that worked that land, was not ethically earned. So I don't think that I don't think it's a given that you can just say that if it is income, it must have been earned.
I completely agree. And that's because the peasants, the serfs, did not have liberty. They didn't have freedom to move. They didn't have freedom to own property, just like everyone else. Or just, there wasn't equality of access to property. So I think, I say libertarian because I have, I think that the right to property is something that needs to be protected, because specifically for the little guy to have their property and their money to be protected,
so
and to not be abused.
You believe principally that all people should have the same, like, I don't know, like opportunity, or I mean, it sounds like you're saying that all people should have the same rights to be able to earn an income or whatever without somebody having more of an advantage over somebody else.
Um, I would conceive of it more like everyone has the right to own the product of their labor, and that would include selling the product of your labor and trading the
So
product of your labor.
you have the right to somebody else's the product of somebody else's labor.
No, that's the principle I'm
So
against.
are
You
you in
don't have the right to someone else's labor. You have the right to
are
trade
you
that
in
labor.
favor of abolishing inheritance and making it
No,
illegal for you to like inherit money from your wealthy parents or something?
of course not, because if it's my property, I get to decide what happens with it, including giving it to people or trading it to people.
Okay, so then that inevitably results in like an aristocratic situation, right?
No, because most inheritance doesn't last till the third generation. Most money is new money because unless they actually have merit and can actually create a working business that creates value in society, they will just end up burning through that money and it will all be lost because so even if they start up with a foot up, unless you can reinvest that money and keep it going through merit, it gets spent. And so that's why most generational wealth gets spent back into the market and most
Aren't a
money is new
huge
money.
fraction of like the current wealthiest people like inheritance babies? Like it's like a
I
pretty
don't know.
large fraction of like the wealthiest 10%, 5%
Yeah,
are.
but how long is that going to last? Are their grandchildren going to be?
Well, they're
Not for
currently
long.
like currently right now, it's a huge percentage. So why should we expect for that percentage to change when it seems like it's been pretty constant?
Well, yeah, the second generation of successful people are going to be rich as well. But the third and fourth generations, most of them, I think it's like 75%, that inheritance doesn't last to the third or fourth generation.
And yet still today that the number of the wealthy people that are have their wealth through inheritance is still a very significant fraction and not it's not trending down.
But I don't view that as taking away from anyone because that money was already earned by someone else and it was just given to someone in their family. And so,
I'll just answer
you know,
A's
if
philosophy. A's asked, why do I care? Do I just want to take their money because you don't like them having it? The answer is yes. I consider it fundamentally immoral for billionaires to exist. So maybe that is a big, difference
yeah,
between.
I don't care if you're a billionaire or a trillionaire as long as you actually earned it. If you didn't defraud anyone, if you didn't take it by force from anyone, if you legitimately earned it, if you are a singer and you sell 10 billion albums, I don't care if you make a profit on every single one of those albums because people chose to give their money to
Mhm.
you for the product.
Right. But I mean, I think it is immoral once you reach a certain amount of wealth. But also, I want to say someone in the chat is calling you out saying that's false. Most money is old money. So,
Uh, yeah, I mean, I would have to push back on that.
all right. Well, then I guess it would depend on what the actual data would show,
Okay.
whether or not most money is old money or if it's new money, Silicon Valley money or not. But um,
I mean, I guess it depends on how you measure it. The stats I've heard is how wealth doesn't last through the generations. Most wealth disperses by the third generation.
So basically, my conception is regardless of how the money was earned, if you have a situation where some human, like some children, are born into abject poverty, and some children are born to as with billionaire parents, I consider that fundamentally wrong, like
Why?
a moral injustice.
Well, like what moral principle does that violate?
I can't explain to you the moral principle. I can just say when I see that, regardless of the situations that brought that about, even if it was completely earned, like you say, I consider that to be morally abhorrent and bad. And I don't think that in my ideal society, like when I think of the way that the human species ought to be in the future, I don't think that that would happen.
Okay, so if I totally self-produce an album and I get 4 billion people to buy this album online and they each give me $2 and
Mm-hmm.
now I have $8 billion
Yeah.
or minus whatever taxes, you know.
Yeah.
But why is that immoral?
Because you have too much money that any one human should be able to have. I don't think it is moral to allow one human to have access to that much wealth because
Is it
wealth.
because that's like too much of a risk? It's too dangerous for one
No,
person to have that much power,
no,
or
no. It's partly because they
you
shouldn't have
just
that much
think that they
power.
have
I think it's morally wrong. I don't care about the risk. I think it is wrong
yeah,
for
but I'm trying to
having
understand
that.
why. Like, is it because you think they have a moral duty to share if they have that much?
No, I just think they should not be allowed to have that much
But
because in
why? Like,
principle,
what's the harm, or what's wrong with
because
that?
I'm against aristocrats, I'm against kings, I'm against gods. I don't think that we should have such inequality as a human species. I'm against it in principle. I don't even care if they're a saint and they're Mother Teresa and they're using their money for good. I don't think any human should be allowed to be that powerful. And like in an in an undemocratic way. I mean, I don't think really any human should be that powerful singularly. So I'm and wealth is power. So I don't think that it is moral to allow for one individual humans or families to
But
be
yeah,
that powerful and wealthy.
so this is why I say I'm a libertarian, is because I look at that as a consensual interaction between the consumer and the producer, and that's it. As long as it's a consensual interaction, I'm fine with it.
I guess I'm just looking at it as to how I think like what is best for humanity. And I don't think it's good for humanity to have such differences between haves and have-nots. I don't think it's good for
So
the
what
species, good for our future.
but it's not taking money out of anyone's pockets. It's they're
I
choosing
don't
to
care.
say,
Like I said, I
like,
don't care
what
where the money comes from. It's the fact that they have that much of it. That's what I consider wrong.
okay, so what would you do? Like, say
I would
after a
have
certain amount
I
of
would have
albums
a
sold, you have to give it for
yeah,
free?
the marginal tax rate increases like
Okay.
progressively. So eventually it just becomes 100%. But
Okay.
like eventually, like you're allowed to make you're allowed to be very wealthy still. You could still be a millionaire. I just don't think we should have billionaires. They should be taxed out of existence. Like they can still be millionaires. They can still have a lot of money, but billionaires is immoral.
And what if you want to use that profit to invest in an industry where that you say can't survive without government subsidies?
If the
What if they
government
had
wants to do that
what if
or
they
what? Well, they are doing that by paying their taxes.
but then they have no more control over that. They
Yes.
can't put their creative license into it. It has to
Yes.
go through bureaucracy. A
Yes.
lot
I
of the
was
value
in
is going to be
favor for
lost.
limiting the power of wealthy individuals. I don't think that they should be that powerful.
Okay.
Like, I think it's stupid that we allow Elon Musk to spend his money to try to go to Mars.
Oh, I don't. I think we need to start going to the stars.
I think that that's a waste of his money at this juncture.
But I mean,
I'm in favor of going to the stars. I just think it's a waste of his money to do that right now as a private individual.
Well, they're
And I
making
think
more
that the way that
progress
he's
than
spending his
NASA
money,
is.
huh?
They're making more progress than NASA
I
on
don't
some of
necessarily
the rocket
see that that's
technology.
true at all.
So NASA has the same technology as them?
No, they have different technologies. They're different institutions. But again, I mean,
Yeah. Yeah,
NASA,
because the private guys want to do something else.
yeah,
They have their own creative
I
vision, which I think
fundamentally think that it's going to end horribly. Like if I was betting on it, I would bet that this is going to end very, very badly and a huge waste of money. Because I don't think
like colonizing Mars.
having Elon Musk colonize Mars, I think is going
Okay.
to end horribly. And also colonizing Mars is not going to go very well either. It's kind of a horrible place to live. There's no magnetic field.
Yeah.
I mean, you're just going to get dosed in radiation if you go outside. It's not a good place for humans.
Unless you nuke the polar ice caps and create an atmosphere, or well, I
That's
guess
not
that
going to
won't give
create
you
a
the
magnetic
magnetic.
field, though.
Yeah.
That's still not going to create a magnetic field.
True.
Without a
True.
magnetic field, you're screwed. So I don't think it's smart. I don't think it's a good use of money. I think that that money should be taken from him and given to actual worthwhile projects that the government is actually doing. Look at the Infrastructure Reduction Act. That's a way better use of money than anything Elon Musk has ever done.
So I understand your line of logic, but I still think, on a moral principle, that the government should not have the power to interrupt at least most consensual activities. Just because I think you have to have a moral principle there, even if it can be argued like, hey, if I take your stuff from you, I can invest it better than you ever could. Well, even if that were true, you don't have the right to take my stuff from me, no matter how much or how little stuff I have. And I think that keeps society from going down into the totalitarian direction, which pretty much never has good uses
I
of
think
money.
ultimately, if you stick with that principle, only disaster will result. I personally think that that is not a good principle that serves humanity for the future, because I think what that principle entails is more and more concentration of wealth into fewer and fewer hands as an inevitability, as something that is inevitably leads from that principle. If you don't think that you can just tax the rich, then what's going to happen is the rich are going to continue to get richer and richer and richer, and
But
it's
I see
through the human society.
But I see government having the ability to control the product of other people's labor and property as doing the same thing. We both have the same thing that we're trying to avoid, I guess.
Yeah, so it's
I
just
think
weird to
it's
me
going to
if
have.
we're trying to avoid the same thing. I feel like mine is not being led from principles. I feel like it's being led from empiricism and rationality. That's what I'm trying to base. I'm not trying to base it on any pie in the sky principles or ideology. I'm not. I don't believe. I'm not a moral realist. I don't think about those things.
I'm a moral realist.
So I
I
don't
was
give a
going to
shit
ask
about
you.
principles or ideology. I'm just looking what is the most effective way to secure the outcome I think is the best, which is to minimize wealth inequality. So I'm looking at it from a practical, empirical, rational point of view. And I think that those principles that you've outlined, the libertarian principles, inevitably lead you to the outcome you don't want. So just from a practical and like functional perspective, I think we should go with what has empirical justification to actually create the outcomes we both want.
And I see the empirical data showing that like central planning and huge governments actually paradoxically would have the opposite effect.
Well, if you look at the research on this, I encourage you, there are data for most developed nations on the level of wealth inequality together with economic policies, and you can see the exact opposite trend in the data. So, like, you can literally see at what point economic inequality took a nosedive around most countries was in the New Deal era, when you had a huge expansion of the government. That's when you had actually good results happen with in terms of wealth inequality, that's when you had the best results. And it's when you had a loosening of regulation and a lowering of the highest tax rates, that's when you ended up getting, like, those are libertarian principles. That's when you ended up getting the most amount of wealth inequality, just as a matter of fact and data and empiricism.
But again, I don't care necessarily about the inequality as much as what's the lowest line. And when free market principles were introduced and, the monarchies were overthrown, that was when we saw the biggest reduction in poverty overall.
Right? You mean the Industrial Revolution with technology?
That's part of it.
I mean, that seems like almost all of it.
No, because industrialized nations that didn't have free market principles killed a lot of people and were plunged into extreme poverty.
Like
the USSR and China.
I mean, China had more extreme poverty before that period, and so did the USSR. So there was never any point where their bottom went lower. I mean, Russia was already starting out as having, some of the worst
Well,
living conditions in all of Europe, and
I mean,
China
because
had
the dead
horrible.
people don't count as poor, I suppose.
Huh?
The dead people don't count as poor, I
This has
suppose.
nothing to do with that. We're talking about the conditions for the poor in the 19th century in Russia and China. They were still among the worst in their respective regions. It's not like they declined after they had socialist revolutions. I mean, I don't think that this tracks with the data, but I mean, I'm not advocating for Soviet style or Mao style
Hmm.
economies over here. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm not advocating for that at all.
and,
But
and I'm not advocating total anarcho-capitalism.
okay, so I guess at least we've gotten closer to highlighting our own similarities on this. I really do think that overall we're much more similar than we are different.
Mhm.
So I don't know. I guess we're over 2 hours now. I think I'm gonna wrap it up. But I
Okay.
did really enjoy this conversation. I did think that we got to highlight our differences in this dialogue, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and hopefully, you said like maybe an hour or 45 minutes ago that you didn't quite feel like you understand why I'm a libertarian. Maybe more of my explanations of the moral principles helps with that.
Yeah, you definitely seem like you're led by moral principles in this of, what, yeah, like the
Yeah.
rights of the individual and everything like that.
Because to give one last example is like, I don't care whether slavery produces more or does not. I only care that it is right that there are no slaves. And I think that human beings will figure out a way to live without slaves. So I think that,
Hmm.
that principle, or that whatever that is, kind of holds true for a lot of things.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, I think that there's more that you need for your principles other than just through the lens of individuals, because ultimately humans are not individuals. We're a
Mhm.
population.
Yeah,
And
and I definitely take into account group self-defense, and risk to the group. If your individual actions are risking other individuals or other groups, I
yes.
think.
So wealth inequality, you said you don't care about wealth inequality, but
Mhm.
objectively speaking, wealth inequality harms the group.
So I don't care about wealth inequality as a metric in and of itself is not an indicator that there's something wrong, because there might be just one person who's doing, or a small amount of people who are doing something really well. I look more
But
to
just
it. It could be an indicator that there's something
in
wrong.
history, right? Anytime we see a society get more and more extreme wealth inequality, it almost always leads to a collapse of that government.
Yeah. Well, I'm not saying
It's
to
almost
discount
never.
it.
It almost always leads to some kind of regime change. Sometimes to the benefit, but sometimes just leads to chaos. And I don't think ultimately the more wealth inequality we see in a society, the shorter the lifespan of that society typically is, and the closer they are to some sort of chaos and turmoil.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely correlates to there being unfairness in the system, but I think that that's, and I'm not saying to discount it, but I don't think you can just look at that and say, because there's inequality, something must be wrong. Because the
I just
inequality
think it's
might be due
better.
to merit.
I just think
It
it's better
might be,
to minimize inequality. I don't think
yeah,
that
and I
we should strive for perfectly equal. I just think we should strive for
right.
minimalizing it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think if merit was dominating the system, there would be less inequality in general, but
Um,
as a single variable, I just don't
the
find it
only thing
super
I just
useful.
don't think that merit, like a meritocracy, is possible because we have parents. And as long as you have parents and inheritance, you're never going to have a true meritocracy. So I don't think it's
Well, not
possible in
it's not
principle.
going to be pure merit. There's always other variables. Sure.
Yeah. So anyways, we still have a lot to talk
Yeah.
about. There's still, I mean, yeah, this is the first time that I've done like a political kind of discussion slash debate. So this was a lot of fun, at least to talk to somebody that's not like to talk to somebody that I agree with more than I disagree with. So,
Yeah. And
uh,
you're a very good challenger as well.
oh, well, thank
And
you.
yeah.
I definitely like to argue. That's why I do this. So,
Yeah.
cool. I'm glad that we're still friends, even though we disagree on certain things. I don't, I'm still happy to see you and have you on the channel, Snake. So, thanks for joining. And again, I just want to say Snake does a great job debating topics in science like evolution, creationism, and I'm really looking forward to his upcoming debate with Robertson Janus on later on this month. And everyone, I encourage you to check out Snake's YouTube channel. And with that, we've been going on for over 2 hours now, so I'm going to end the stream here. So thank you, Snake. Thank you, everyone that tuned in and was engaging in the comments, except for the people that were writing stupid things in the comments. You're entertaining, but I don't appreciate you. And with that, have a good night, everybody.